Now, in today's study, we're going to be going over the life of the prophet Ezekiel. We went over a little bit of this prophet in our Daniel study as well as that of Jeremiah, but let's just get started right off the bat with verse 1 in the book of Ezekiel. Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. In 605 BC, just as we went over in all of our other studies, in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded Jerusalem, only subduing it, not destroying it. 605 BC would be the beginning of the 70 years of captivity. The attack would be the first of 3 invasions by Babylon upon the Jewish people. So there were 3 stages that made up what we know of as the Babylonian captivity. In 605 BC, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and others were taken into Babylon. About 8 years later, in 597 BC, would Ezekiel and others be taken in the second deportation. The prophet Ezekiel also states how he was by the river Chebar at the time of his calling, his very first vision of the true God. And as you'll see right here, it was a little distance from the actual city of Babylon that the Jewish people would make these settlements, and Chebar was just right along these lines. Verse 2 continues, in the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity, not Jehoiakim, as we focused in on in our Daniel studies, but Jehoiakim, his son. And Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiakim, or rather Coniah, I like using that title for him. It was an alternative name for Jehoiakim because it really gets confusing, these Jehoiakim and so forth. But Jehoiakim or Coniah was taken captive in 597 BC. 5 years later would set this date at 592 BC. Only 6 years before the ultimate fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So the point I'm trying to make with all of that is this: Ezekiel had been in Babylon, according to the first 2 verses, for 5 years, and was 30 years old by the river Chebar. Now, it's quite important to note that Ezekiel was 30 years old. That's about the age that Jesus, his ministry began, as well as we believe John the Baptist. Ezekiel, being of the priestly line, would have just been beginning his normal priestly work at the age of 30. If he was still in Jerusalem, he would have just started to perform his priestly duties at the age of 30. It appears God still intended to give Ezekiel a ministry, only of the prophetic sort and in Babylon. And real quick, just as you can read from this chart, Ezekiel is right down here. He's a contemporary with the prophet Daniel as well as the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah would be preaching in Jerusalem at the time of Ezekiel, preaching in Babylon, while Daniel would have been rising up in the upper echelons of Babylon during that time. And as you can tell by keeping up with all of these studies, the great importance of this Babylonian captivity, and you may be scratching your head asking yourself, what is the big deal with the Babylonian captivity? All the other nations, they were taken captive as well, and they don't make such a big deal about it as this southern kingdom of Judah within Israel. Well, it's a huge deal. The Babylonian captivity would be the end of the Davidic kings reigning over the Jewish people. And 400 years before, God had promised David that he would always have a son to sit upon the throne over the Jewish people. But because of their stern disobedience against God and against his will and against his calling, God did not send anyone to reign over them for the next 500 years. And suddenly we see Jesus show up on the scene. And he was to be their king. Matter of fact, whenever they crucified Jesus, Pontius Pilate actually had posted above him the reason why he was being crucified, and he wrote, King of the Jews. And they had rejected their king, and that's the reason why the Gentiles are now the focus point. That's the reason why we're now in the years of the time of the Gentile. And all of this will culminate, according to biblical prophecy, all of this will culminate with Christ returning and establishing his reign over both Jews and Gentiles. And it will be at that point that the Davidic reign will begin again and will never cease, as promised. Verse 3 in the book of Ezekiel then continues, "The word of the Lord came expressly unto Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans," or Babylonians, "in the land of the Babylonians, by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was there upon him. And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself, and a brightness was about it, and out of the midst thereof as the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire." Now, just so you all know, we have went over in our ministry, we've went over every single verse on video of this book of Ezekiel. So if you would like specific details regarding these visions, because Ezekiel has a lot of them, so if you would like specific details regarding them, we have went over them, and all you'd have to look up is Bible Study, Eyes Like Fire Ministry, Ezekiel, and the chapter. So for the sake of time in this study, we're not going to go into details with these visions. Ezekiel then goes on to describe the cherubim, the wheels, and the one sitting upon the throne. Towards the end of the first chapter, the prophet then details his own reaction to seeing this. "This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard a voice of one that spake." And that is the typical reaction of these prophets, the John the Revelator and the book of, and all of these. Isaiah, he just falls into utter ruin. He thinks he's going to actually be killed, it seems. And they all are just so terrified at these visions. Chapter 2 then goes on to detail the first commission given to the prophet Ezekiel. "Speak every word I tell you to the rebellious house of Judah." The second chapter then ends with Ezekiel being handed a scroll to eat. Written on the inside and outside were, and I quote, "lamentations, mourning, and woe." Now right here's a general layout of the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel's prophecies are divided into three parts. First, the condemnation of Judah and the total destruction of Jerusalem is outlined in chapters 1 through 24. The prophecies against foreign nations, 25 through 39. And number 3, the plans for rebuilding the new temple fill up the final 9 chapters. So one may read that and think, well, that's a pretty easy layout to understand. I don't even need to read it. I'll read 1 or 2 chapters and that, oh, you're missing out on everything. You have no idea. You'll see as the study goes on. It's very intriguing, the book of Ezekiel. The prophet is then taken up in a vision and sent to some of the captives of Tel Aviv, where they sat motionless in mourning for 7 days. Now it is believed that this plays out in a vision before him. Ezekiel is then taken to the plain, where he once again encounters the Lord, causing the prophet to immediately fall upon his face before him. The Lord then commands him to, and I quote, "Go, shut thyself within thine house." Next, in chapter 4, Ezekiel was commanded to draw Jerusalem on a tile, much like this brick right here. He was commanded to draw Jerusalem on a tile and set a siege against it, giving a visual of the besiegement which would occur. It's believed that he did this in a place where people could observe the demonstration, possibly in his doorway, within his house still, but where the public could come around and view this. He was also commanded to lay on his left side, as depicted right here, to lay on his left side to symbolically bear the iniquity of Israel, the 10 tribes specifically, those of the northern kingdom that had been taken well over 100 years before in the Assyrian captivity. He was to bear the iniquity of them for 390 days. Then he was to lay on his right side for 40 days to bear Judah's iniquity. Each day was to represent 1 year. The northern kingdom of Israel's, the 10 tribes, their 390 years dated back to the time of Jeroboam, whenever he set up his 2 calves over the kingdoms, and all of a sudden they just sinned perpetually without end. So that 390 was a huge buildup. Judah's 40 dated back to Josiah's covenant and around the time that the people would break that covenant to serve the Lord thy God only, to never worship these idols again, and they quickly turned away from it after Josiah's death. Right here on this chart, we have a visual of the actual timeline. Jeroboam in the right column, he was the very beginning of these idolatries located within the northern kingdom of Israel, and to the left you see Judah and Josiah, right before all of these red, bad kings right after him. Now, for any of you who might be interested, we have went over King Jeroboam as well as King Josiah in our previous studies, so if any of you would like to watch those, feel free. So those were only part of the instructions that this prophet Ezekiel was to play out before these captives in Babylon, because many of them believed that they were going to be freed and returned to Jerusalem, that Nebuchadnezzar would eventually be defeated and then all would turn back to normal. But God was sending these prophets to say to them, look, this is my hand doing this. This is not Nebuchadnezzar leading. You all have so much faith in your temple within Solomon's temple in Jerusalem that you think I won't have you all destroyed and taken captive and all of this because of your disobedience. God is letting the people know, the captives in Babylon as well as those in Jerusalem, through the prophet Jeremiah, he's letting them know, I am doing this. Nebuchadnezzar is not defeating me or going to destroy the temple because his god Marduk is stronger than me. He's letting them know beforehand, I am the reason why you're in Babylon. I have warned you and warned you and warned you. But more instructions were given unto the prophet Ezekiel. He was also commanded to be bound during these 390 days and eat of food cooked with man's dung. Right here in the fire, cooked with man's dung. This was to represent the desperate situation the holy people of God would soon find themselves in, eating defiled food in a strange land, doing things that they never would have done otherwise. Ezekiel pleads with the Lord to not force him to be so defiled, resulting in the Lord changing the dung from that of a man to cow's dung. Ezekiel chapter 5 goes on to tell us of the Lord's next command. Ezekiel was to cut his hair and beard. This was for a sign of mourning, which the people would have recognized right away, but was forbidden for a priest, often signifying his loss of the priestly office. He was to then take the hair and divide it into thirds, the symbolism being that God's judgment is exact to a hair's weight. He was to weigh them out in balances. He then takes 1/3 of it and burns it in the midst of Jerusalem. Symbolically, we believe on this tile. He sets it upon the tile that was already probably still in display. He sets it upon there, burns it in the midst of the city. 1/3 was struck with the sword. 1/3 was scattered in the wind. Verse 12 of that chapter then tells us about this. A third part of these shall die with the pestilence, and with famine shall they be consumed in the midst of thee, Jerusalem. And a third part shall fall by the sword round about thee, and I will scatter a third part into all the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them. So once again, Jeremiah's message is being reinforced with these captives in Babylon. Don't expect to not be in Babylon for the next 70 years as prophesied, as told to you over and over. In chapter 6, Ezekiel was commanded to prophesy against all of Israel, including Judah, against the mountains, as they were the most common places of idol worship. Around a year and a half later, as chapter 8 begins, the Lord shows Ezekiel certain horrible abominations occurring in and around the temple in Jerusalem. And this is truly a striking part of all the prophets. One truly can never forget what is written and what Ezekiel sees and what God shows Ezekiel that he truly sees. There was once Leonard Ravenhill, he preached about a woman in whom she had prayed a prayer one time and petitioned God and said, Lord, show me the world as you see it. Leonard Ravenhill said, oh, what a terrifying prospect. He said, don't ask such a thing. He says, you really want God to open up the earth, the evil that's within it, like an apple, and let you see the core root? You'd go insane. It would drive you mad. Well, the prophet Ezekiel actually is shown these things. And these are things occurring not just in Jerusalem, but in the temple itself in secret. 70 elders, he's shown these. 70 elders paying homage to false gods within a secret place of the temple. 70 elders paying homage to false gods upon a wall. women crying over the false god Tammuz, and then 25 men worshiping the sun right there at the very door of the temple. I tell you now, my friends, if you and I were to see the things going on within the nations of the world right now, the secret evils occurring behind closed doors, what we see in the open is so evil it's unimaginable. What they do in the dark that God sees, you wonder what's holding back his wrath, except for just divine mercy that is infinite and beyond all comprehension. It must be God's mercy. In chapter 9, the Lord commands the prophet to call upon those that have, and I quote, charge over the city, believed to be angelic beings. He's to call upon these, there's 6 of them, to draw near with weapons in their hands. Of the 6, there was a 7th, more superior, who appeared with an inkhorn, commanded to mark certain individuals throughout the city that were to be spared. Then went the 6 beings with weapons throughout the city, slaughtering all that were not marked, beginning with the sun worshippers, the 25 sun worshippers that Ezekiel had viewed in the last. And they were the closest to the actual Holy of Holies, and that's the reason why God begins with them. Chapter 11 then finishes the vision with Ezekiel being shown the glory of the Lord departing from the temple. And to a priest especially, this would have been heart-wrenching. The glory of the Lord departing from the temple, but not before promising a new spirit and heart to the remnant that would return. In chapter 12, another demonstration is ordered by the Lord. In chapter 12, Ezekiel was commanded to bore a hole through his wall and carry his possessions in front of the people. This was to represent the future actions of Judah's king at that time, attempting to flee by going out secretly through Jerusalem's wall, later being captured and brought to Babylon, speaking of King Zedekiah. Verse 11 then tells us, say, I am your sign. Like as I have done, so shall it be done unto them. They shall remove and go into captivity. My net also will I spread upon him, Zedekiah, the king of Judah at that time. My net also will I spread upon him, and he shall be taken in my snare. Now pay close attention. And I will bring him to Babylon, to the land of the Chaldeans, yet shall he not see it, though he shall die there. So how's he going to come to the land of Babylon if he's not going to be able to see it? And this would have been very confusing to everyone at the time. But you realize the way that Zedekiah winds up, it is just so traumatic. King Zedekiah would later be captured, brought before Nebuchadnezzar along with his sons. His sons would then be executed right in front of him, and then his eyes would be put out, and he would be brought into Babylon blind. And for any of you interested, once again, we do have an entire video on this King Zedekiah, the blinded final king of Judah. Ezekiel then goes on to prophesy against the false prophets and prophetesses who work dark arts, leading souls away from God. And there are so many chapters that I'm not going to go over in this study of the book of Ezekiel, like that of the parable of the 2 young lions, the 2 eagles, tallest branch, the divine sword, the 2 sisters. All of these we go over. The soul that sinneth shall die. All of these, many of you have already heard about. Judah's evils detailed. Some of these, even Charles Spurgeon said no pastor could ever preach some of these behind the pulpit because they're so descriptive. But once again, we do go over all of them verse by verse, so you all can see our entire studies about them if you wish. Ezekiel 24 begins with the prophet being commanded on the exact day that Nebuchadnezzar began his final 1.5-year-long siege against Jerusalem. Now, this would be at the very beginning, on the very day of the siege. Ezekiel was commanded to fill a seething pot with choice meats, with bones within the fire beneath. The cauldron is Jerusalem, the pieces of flesh, the inhabitants, the fire and boiling, the siege with its terrible severities. The pieces of flesh shall be pulled out of the cauldron indiscriminately, symbolizing the universal dispersion when the siege is over. The cauldron was then to be set empty upon the coals, that its rust and foulness may be molten and consumed, signifying the ruin in which the city itself of Jerusalem, the holiest city in the whole world, shall long lie in complete ruin. Chapter 24 then continues with truly one of the saddest of all parts of the Old Testament. Also the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, behold, I take away from thee the desire of thine eyes with a stroke. Yet neither shalt thou mourn nor weep, neither shall thy tears run down. God is saying he's going to take Ezekiel's wife. And notice the poetry involved right here. I take away from thee the desire of thine eyes with a stroke. Forbear to cry, make no mourning for the dead. Bind the tire of thine head upon thee, and put on thy shoes upon thy feet, and cover not thy lips, and eat not the bread of men. Now these were the customary steps that the Jewish people would take in mourning, but Ezekiel, he's forbidden to do any of these outward displays. Keep your shoes on your feet, don't cover your lips, eat not the bread of men, because they would usually send bread unto them as kind of consoling. So I spake unto the people in the morning, and at the evening my wife died, and I did in the morning as I was commanded. And it's to this situation that Feinberg commented, he was not forbidden to sorrow. Ezekiel was not forbidden to sorrow, for even our Lord wept at the grave of Lazarus. He was only prohibited from a loud manifestation of it, which was in contrast to the usual loud wailing on such occasions. The general truth may be found in Jeremiah 16:5, where it is shown that all personal sorrow will be eclipsed in the hour of universal calamity. Basically, such shock would happen to the Jewish people whenever the city, the temple are destroyed, because they thought the city would stand forever. That's why they kept rebuilding and all of this, refurbishing and adding to it. And so the calamity that was about to occur within Jerusalem would so shock all Jewish people, no matter where they lived at that time, or the captives that were already in Babylon. No matter where they were, once they heard about Solomon's temple being destroyed that they thought would stand forever, their faith would be shaken by this. They would think, wait a minute, we were told that God would always maintain his house. Nothing would ever happen to it. But then they forgot about the law. And in the law, the Lord said, if you disobey me and you go into perpetual sin over and over and you stay away from me, he said, I will disperse you among all the nations and make your land desolate and put you in a strange land. And that is exactly what God is doing to them. And he's reminding them through these prophets over and over, look, I warned you. Verse 19 then continues, and the people said unto me, wilt thou not tell us what these things are to us, that thou doest so? Why are you not mourning for your wife? Then I answered them, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, speak unto the house of Israel, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I will profane my sanctuary, the excellency of your strength, the desire of your eyes, and that which your soul pitieth, and your sons and your daughters, whom ye have left, shall fall by the sword. And ye shall do as I have done. Ye shall not cover your lips in astonishment, nor eat the bread of men. You'll be so shocked that you'll not even have time to grieve. It would also be at that time that Ezekiel would be struck dumb or mute regarding his prophesying any more to Judah until the time of the captivity was complete. No more prophesying unto you all, but he would prophesy against the other nations. And so for the next 15 chapters, from Ezekiel 25 to Ezekiel 39, would he be prophesying against the nations. But notice, my friends, and this is so overlooked among most preachers regarding this very important section of Ezekiel, he begins prophesying against the nations with that of Tyre, in whom is likened and shares the same attributes with Babylon the Great mentioned in the book of Revelation. You can even label it, as I did, Tyre, the Old Testament Babylon the Great. And this is truly astounding. And I'll tell you, most people's attention is only directed to Ezekiel 28 during all of these prophecies, but at least check out the chapters right before it, beginning with chapters 25, 26, 27, 28. You won't even have to watch my Bible studies. Just read them for yourself. You will be shocked if you are aware of what is written in the book of Revelation, and you'll see a foreshadowing with God's prophesying of doom upon Tyre at that time, and that of Babylon the Great, which would represent the entire world and our future end time events. Chapter 37, though, is particularly noteworthy, beginning with this: "The hand of the Lord was upon me, and carried me out in the spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the midst of the valley which was full of bones, and caused me to pass by them round about. And behold, there were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord, thou knowest. Again he said unto me, Prophesy upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and ye shall live." Now, many have reckoned that this imagery is in reference to the ultimate resurrection of the dead, and you could equate it to that. It's going to be somewhat similar to this, but there are differences involved. It is rather symbolic of the rebirth of the nation of Israel. The literal resurrection of the dead will not occur in stages, as denoted here. A little bit of sinew and then such and such. They will not occur in stages as denoted here, but apparently very sudden, as in the twinkling of an eye. Let's just go over the New Testament prophecy regarding the resurrection of the dead, our glorified bodies given to us. 1 Corinthians 15:52, the Apostle Paul wrote, "In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed." In the twinkling of an eye. We then go on in chapters 38 and 39 with this Gog and Magog, and it's part 1 and 2. We go over all of that. Truly fascinating. I believe that so many of you would benefit from watching our studies on that. It would then be in 572 BC, according to the prophet Ezekiel. He gives us the year. In 572 BC, 14 years after Jerusalem had been destroyed along with Solomon's temple, that the prophet Ezekiel received a vision of the final temple, which will be set up during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, this isn't exactly how it's described or look like. This is just an artist's rendition, but it will just completely eclipse all the other temples built before it. And the book of Ezekiel would end with detailing not only the millennial temple in chapters 40 through 43, but also talking about this millennial prince, in whom I believe is describing Christ. Once again, people are going to disagree with that. They're going to say that he's talking about David, and we'll just agree to disagree. That's perfectly fine. But then the book itself actually ends with giving further details regarding the priestly work that will happen and occur during the millennial reign. Now, those visions would be given to the prophet Ezekiel about halfway through the Babylonian captivity. 33 years later, would Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, liberate the Jewish people from Babylon in 539 BC. The 70 years captivity prophecy, however, would be fulfilled in 535 BC, 4 years later, when larger groups would begin returning to Jerusalem. So from 605 BC to 535 BC, we find this 70-year captivity completed. Now, these are just closing notes. Many believe that the temple described by Ezekiel at the end of the book of Ezekiel would be that of the second or rebuilt temple, that of Zerubbabel. Whenever they return from Babylon, they think that he's describing that temple. But it's so magnificent, there's no way. And we're even told Zerubbabel's temple lacked completely in every respect to that of Solomon's temple. And this temple being described by Ezekiel is far more grand than even Solomon's. Also note how Jerusalem is not even mentioned throughout chapters 40 through 48. Jerusalem not mentioned one time. The final verse tells us why. Ezekiel 48:35 completes the book of Ezekiel. It was round about 18,000 measures, and the name of the city from that day shall be, The Lord is there. And no longer, my dear friends, would that be meant in the spiritual or symbolic sense as before with the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies, Solomon's Temple, but the Lord himself, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, will reign from that city in that day.